Welcome to Rice University and to this extraordinary panel that you'll hear from in a few minutes. We're going to talk about climate change and climate risk. Also want to welcome all of you who are joining by webcast. This event is being webcast live. And for those of you who like to tweet, either in the room or elsewhere, the hashtag is climate risk, so you can easily find us and carry on the conversation there. My name is Neal. I'm a very long time Rice person. Not as long as some in the room, but a very long time. I am a senior fellow in science and technology at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. Very pleased to be the moderator of today's panel discussion. When the Union of Concerned Scientists contacted me about having an event like this, obviously I was enthusiastic about the idea, but also reached out to colleagues that I knew had been very concerned for a very long time about climate change and had expertise in important areas, and I will introduce them in just a few minutes. But I was asked to say a few words by way of context about climate change. You'll hear from the experts in a minute. First thing to say, I think, is the American public is increasingly concerned, and many climate experts believe that climate change is the most urgent issue of our time. Here's what we know. Climate change is real. Witness the droughts and the floods and the shift in growing seasons, species migration or extinction, sea level rise, coral death, glacial melting, sea ice thinning, and many other indicators that climate researchers have been monitoring, analyzing, studying for years, for decades. The impacts of climate change are mainly negative. That's clear for humans and the environment, land, air, and oceans, and they're getting worse. Now, projections of the impacts of climate change far into the future are very difficult. They require sophisticated computer modeling, same kind of modeling that's used in every other area of science where one is trying to predict the future evolution of complex systems. But while different models may disagree on the details, none of the models offer us any really good news. Disadvantaged communities are particularly vulnerable since they're often located in areas that routinely flood and are subject to air and water pollution. Social justice is very much a part of any policy discussion, consideration related to climate change. On one level, the science is simple. Climate change is the result of average warming of the Earth due to the buildup of greenhouse gases over a long period of time. Those greenhouse gases trap the radiation from the sun in the form of heat energy. The primary culprit among the greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide because it stays in the atmosphere for a very long time and has been increasing for decades. And most carbon dioxide emissions come from human activity, the burning of fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, and particularly coal. What to do? Well, long list of things, and we'll have discussions about that. There are three options, I think. Reduce the emissions significantly over the next few decades to keep warming well under 2 degrees centigrade, hopefully less, as called for in the Paris Accord. Second, try to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, or cut off some sunlight, what's being called geoengineering. It's interesting. We don't know much about it. It's a very high-risk endeavor. Third, we can ignore the problem. You may know people who feel that way. Can ignore the problem, which is likely to lead to warming of 4 degrees centigrade or more, and then deal with the devastating consequences. Well, getting a handle on this problem requires people to act individually, through organizations, and through government. It's a global issue. The challenges for the world, all nations, China and India, as well as the US and the other economically developed nations, have a special role to play. They're large emitters, so they have a large role. Fossil fuel companies and their investors also have a very large role to play. People want energy. They want heat, air conditioning, especially down here, electricity for their computers and entertainment systems, fuel for their cars and trucks at a price they can afford. Companies and governments simply have to work together to deliver the public's energy needs while significantly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, you'll hear in a minute that the research on climate change has gotten better and better, reducing uncertainties about how fast the climate is changing and the causes. As the science gets better, however, the news gets worse. Increasingly, climate researchers are expressing alarm that we may be near a tipping point where the spiral of destructive climate change is simply irreversible. Residents of the Texas Gulf Coast are particularly vulnerable to rising sea level, storm surges, flooding. It's true, we've always experienced such events. Climate change just makes them worse. You may be interested in a report by the National Academy of Sciences published last year describing how one goes about attributing the climate change, the influence of climate change on extreme weather events. So we as a society, in this country and around the world, have to make some very difficult decisions right now, even if there are remaining uncertainties and still more research to be done, or we face the very real possibility of pretty dire consequences for our children, grandchildren, and pretty much everybody else on the planet. There's some urgency. Longer we wait, the harder it's going to be to deal with. We're very fortunate today to have such a distinguished panel of experts from different sectors to help us to understand the implications of climate change. Given the central role of the fossil fuel industry, Houston is just the right place for such a discussion, and we're grateful to the Union of Concerned Scientists for making this event happen. As I mentioned earlier, but some may be joining us later, the event is being live streamed, webcast, and will remain online for some time. And again, for those who tweet, the hashtag is climate risk. So before I introduce all the members of the panel, which I will, I'd like to call on Kathy Mulvey of the Union of Concerned Scientists, who's helped put all of this together and will explain why UCS considers this issue in this moment in time so important. Kathy is manager of the Union of Concerned Scientists Fossil Fuel Accountability Project and the author of the Climate Accountability Scorecard, which many of you know about. Kathy?
Thanks a lot, Dr. Lane. We're grateful to you and your colleagues at the Baker Institute for hosting this important event. I'm thrilled to be here representing the Union of Concerned Scientists. UCS is a leading science-based advocacy organization, and backed by a network of 500,000 supporters, we strategically mobilize some of the nation's top scientists along with our unique 20,000 member expert network to advocate on issues including climate and energy, clean vehicles, global security, food and environment, and democracy and scientific integrity. So I'm going to set the table for this incredible lineup of speakers with a brief introduction in 3 areas: shareholder meetings, fossil fuel companies, and how the two come together in this moment. First, a word about shareholder meetings. Annual meeting. All right, that's maybe more than I expected. Once a year, the decision makers of publicly traded companies go on stage in front of their own investors, the business press, and the financial world at large. And in the best of times, it's a chance to brag about their performance. In more challenging times, CEOs have to answer to impatient and angry investors. So even if you've never been to a corporate annual meeting, you have a stake in the business of these meetings. Investors are not just the Michael Bloombergs and the Warren Buffetts of the world. They're ordinary people like you and me, teachers, public safety officers, first responders, whose financial security is in the hands of pension funds like the Texas Employees Retirement System, or people who have nest eggs in mutual funds managed by Vanguard, Fidelity, or BlackRock. These funds have a say in the direction of public companies, and through them, you do too. So second, a word about fossil fuel companies. As we've heard from Dr. Lane, emissions from the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas, contribute to global warming. And it turns out that nearly 2/3 of the emissions from the start of the Industrial Revolution can be traced to just 90 entities. Among investor-owned companies, Chevron and ExxonMobil are at the head of the pack. So these two companies, along with BP, ConocoPhillips, Peabody Energy, and Shell, bear an outsized responsibility for climate change, but not just due to the emissions from the burning of their products. These major fossil fuel producers knew about climate science decades ago, and they chose to embark on and fund a deliberate campaign to deceive the public and policymakers and block climate action. So we know this from their own internal documents, and you can read about it in UCS's climate deception dossiers. Now, finally, a word about this particular moment. ExxonMobil's and Chevron's annual meetings are here in Texas next week, and they're the culmination of an annual meeting season that's been a springtime of growing discontent by investors with fossil fuel companies. Just 2 weeks ago, for the first time ever over management's objections, a majority of shareholders of a fossil fuel company voted in favor of a climate-related resolution. 67% of Occidental Petroleum shareholders supported a resolution calling on the company to produce an assessment of long-term portfolio impacts of plausible scenarios that address climate change. It wasn't the first time a climate-related shareholder resolution had passed at a fossil fuel company. 2 years ago, the directors of both BP and Shell recommended support for a resolution directing those companies to improve reporting on climate risk, emissions management, and portfolio resilience, and 98% of shareholders agreed. So as you'll hear from one of our other panelists, Bob Litterman, disclosure of climate-related financial risks is now a mainstream expectation. Even BP and Shell, which have committed to improve disclosure, have a long way to go. ExxonMobil and Chevron aren't even out of the starting blocks. Next week, ExxonMobil faces a resolution similar to the one that just passed at Occidental. Investors with more than $10 trillion in assets under management have pre-declared their support. The New York State Common Retirement Fund, the Church of England, and CalPERS are all urging other shareholders to support this resolution. ExxonMobil is actively opposing the proposal, arguing that the company is doing enough. ExxonMobil, in a welcome move, has come out publicly in support of the U.S. staying in the Paris Climate Agreement. So the company is starting to talk the talk, but it isn't walking the walk. Chevron also faces climate-related shareholder resolutions, including one on how it will transition to a low-carbon economy. As shareholders of both ExxonMobil and Chevron will vote on proposals highlighting inconsistencies between the company's stated positions on climate change and lobbying by trade associations in which they play leadership roles. So the votes taken at these two annual meetings next week will affect all of us. Ongoing failure by Chevron and ExxonMobil to plan for a carbon-constrained world is reckless business with severe consequences, destabilizing the global climate, endangering our communities and our health, and undermining our financial security. Regardless of whether we own shares, we have a right and responsibility to hold companies like Chevron and ExxonMobil accountable for their climate-related positions and actions. Shareholders should send a definitive message to Chevron and ExxonMobil that it's past time for them to get serious about planning for a low-carbon future. I'll pass it back to Dr. Lane.
So let me explain the rest of the agenda today and introduce the rest of our panel. Each panelist will speak for about 8 minutes. We have a timekeeper sitting right here. Will keep us all on time. Then we'll take some time for questions. So please write questions you have on the cards, and they'll be picked up, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of our presentations. One more reminder, I've said it twice, I'll finally say it one more time. The event is being live webcast, and also for those who tweet, the hashtag is climate risk. So the first speaker on our panel will be Dr. André Droxler. Dr. Droxler is professor of earth science at Rice University. He's going to give us a broad view of climate science, of what we know about climate change, implications for the future. Dr. Droxler studies the impact of climate change on coral reefs. Following André, we will hear from Yvette Arellano. She is Policy and Research Liaison for TEJAS, Environmental Justice Advocacy Services, which has done remarkable work organizing and advocating for Gulf Coast communities where Houston's fossil fuel and chemical plants are located. Following Yvette will be Dr. Susan Pacheco, who is MD and at Memorial Hermann Hospital and Associate Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Texas McGovern Medical School. She's also founder of Texas Coalition for Climate Change Awareness. Dr. Pacheco is a pediatric allergist and expert on the threats of human health associated with climate change, especially threats to children's health. And next will be Dr. Robert Bullard, who I think you all know, Distinguished Professor of Urban Planning and Environmental Policy at the Barbara Jordan Mickey Leland School of Public Affairs at Texas Southern University. He's a leading thinker and considered by many to be the father of the field of environmental justice, and he's also a true leader who's helped the frontline communities find a voice in their own defense. And following Dr. Bullard will be Robert Litterman, who is the founding CEO of Capos Capital, and before that he worked 23 years with Goldman Sachs. He is an expert in investor risk. These days, the risk he is worried about, among others, are those related to climate change and the transition to low-carbon economy. So we'll ask André to start off, and then we'll just go down the group from one to another.
All right. Here. Yeah, good?
Yes.
Hello, good evening. Okay, it's kind of tough to talk in 8 minutes and try to convince you that the Earth has changed in terms of its climate, and it's due, kind of to greenhouse gases. Here you have, a diagrams, and it's like a bank account. It's the Earth energy balance. What comes in from the sun, solar radiation, in shortwave radiation, somehow gets into the system. Part of it reached the Earth's surface. It's now re-radiated as long wavelength radiation. There's one thing we have in our Earth, which is very special, the atmosphere. The atmosphere has gases, including greenhouse gases. What comes in is about 340 watts per square meters, and what comes kind of directly out without really involving kind of the climate system is 240. So and now what comes re-radiated by the Earth and leaves to space is 239. There's one extra watts per square meters staying within the system, like your bank account. If you have a good bank, you get interest and you get some energy that remain into the system, but it makes it unbalanced. And so these greenhouse gases, kind of change, kind of the system by about 1 watt per square meters since the Industrial Revolution. Well, but we have record, of CO2, we have measured it now since the late 50s in the atmosphere, but we can go to ice cores, and there we can go back to, by measuring gases in the air bubbles, you can go back to 800,000 years. So let me show you. This is a graph, of CO2 in the last 800,000 years. So 800 is on your left, and today is on your right. And you can see, during the glacial cold period, during the last 800,000 years, we had many of them, 180 parts per million. The warm period, 280. And what you see on the right, you see, kind of this amazing increase of CO2 in the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Wow. No doubt about this, that the atmospheric CO2 concentration has increased dramatically. If you look here on this diagram from 1960 to 2010, this is a rate. It means how many parts per million per year. At the beginning, it was 1, and now we have reached 3. So not only we are emitting CO2 in the atmosphere, we are increasing the rate of the input. Okay? Methane. Go back. From Antarctica. So you can see this is even more exciting, yes? 375, these are parts per billion for the cold period, 680 parts per billion for the warm period, and what a peak since the Industrial Revolution, 1849 or 48 parts per billion. This is February 2017. So you can know from 1980 to today, the methane was increasing and it reached a plateau around 2000, and you can see that it has increased again. And all of this increase of methanes, I didn't mention, but know that this CO2 increase in the atmosphere is, by burning fossil fuel. There's no doubt about it. Methane, kind of is, influenced by, burning fossil fuel, but also, by agriculture. By warming, kind of the high latitudes, we are also changing the system in such a way that, we are now melting the permafrost, and now there are methane that have been frozen into this, kind of cold soil, frozen soil, and this methane, can now be added as a positive feedback, kind of to the increase of methane into the atmosphere. If you add all of this effect of greenhouse gases, and in, other things like nitrous oxide, but other, kind of ozone forcing, into the system by creating by human being, is what I mentioned to you, these greenhouse gases and all this anthropogenic change that we are making on the Earth change, kind of the system by about, but a range of 0.5, to 2.4. So with this, these greenhouse gases, and we have now increased about, I wanted to go, about kind of one increase, since the Industrial Revolution. 1970, Celsius about 0.8 of temperature has been in high latitudes. Kind of records from different sources, areas. This is what we had, what scientists had models. So you can see, kind of we do model quite well, and we are quite faithfully, with the real observation. Again, in May 2016, it was 407 or 8, and now it's 410. So we are increasing. For 2 years, temperature, the heat in sea level, and all for instance, the should be very worried. And so, all right, I'm going to conclude, kind of use my last slides on here. And, we are going to reach, this 1.5 degrees Celsius that we like, kind of to reach, based on the Paris Accord, probably much earlier than expected in 2026. And if you look at here, this is my last slides, where you have, kind of, temperature, see from 0 Celsius, so this is kind of the increase of temperature, to 5 degrees Celsius. Hopefully we will never reach this. But you can see that if now, in terms of food, kind of water, the ecosystem, extreme weather events, and so on, but this is where we are. So already, with about 410, CO2 part per million, we are almost reaching, kind of the 1 degree Celsius, and so let me go and get my arrow back. Glacier have not disappeared yet. Glacier National Park will be probably just a name, in 10 years. The Great Barrier Reef might not exist in 20 years if it continues to bleach like it has done, in the past 3 years. So this is where we are. And now, if you would put, kind of this 1.5 degrees Celsius, we are getting into, some very, kind of dangerous territory. And, kind of this amazing, activity of humankind by burning fossil fuel have changed. We are an amazing species on its way. Have changed, the chemistry, of the atmosphere, and this has created, kind of this increase of temperature on Earth, and this has major influence in the system. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Yvette Arellano.
Yvette Arellano, and I'm with TEJAS. We are over on the east side of Houston, and we advocate for environmental justice communities like that of Manchester, Harrisburg. This is home. This is Houston, Texas, home to the largest petrochemical complex in the entire nation, second largest in the world. And Manchester, Harrisburg is actually found closest to the city, completely engulfed in not only oil and gas industry, but petrochemical industry, with neighbors like the Valero refining facility that pump out about 100,000 barrels per calendar year. And Westway, now Contanda, chemical storage facility with 94 steel carbon storage tanks. These are the lives of an average resident in the neighborhood of Manchester, Harrisburg. Outside, you'll find reports like the Double Jeopardy report and the air toxics report that, because of our friends at Union of Concerned Scientists, lace out the extreme effects or the daily effects and daily toxics that residents in these communities face. Just like our previous speaker said, climate change and increased temperatures have introduced a whole new facet to the lives of these people. For example, on about a monthly basis, every month, last year, there was an event. An event is categorized as anything from a fire, a chemical release, an explosion. During these events, residents in the 11 municipalities along the 16-mile stretch of the Houston Ship Channel and those in Manchester, Harrisburg are told to shelter in place. What does this mean? Well, a shelter in place means you basically go back inside your homes. You lock all windows and doors. You shut off the ventilation system, any air conditioning units that you have. On days like these and days like those in June and July, when temperatures can skyrocket between 110 and 115 degrees, you're asking residents in these communities that are already located in sacrifice zones to put themselves at the detriment to these industries. You're asking those in these vulnerable communities, including children and the elderly, to shut off any ventilation system for about anywhere from half an hour to 3 hours. No one here, I'm sure, would put up with any kind of these conditions. Like our previous speakers and speakers before me have said, climate change also introduces a whole new risk of factors in regards to extreme weather conditions. We saw those during hurricanes like Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana and Hurricane Ike here in our own hometown. In Hurricane Katrina, we saw Bass, which is a chemical storage and crude storage facility, release millions of gallons of oil into neighboring communities like that of Plaquemines Parish. Those are the kind of conditions that we're exposing communities all along the 16-mile stretch of the Houston Ship Channel to. So you're asking people in the communities to shelter in place. Their daily lives look like this. Their daily lives are already exposed to heavy toxics and exposures like that here at Cesar Chavez High School, located on the east side of Houston. They're already exposed to the floodwaters and flash flood events that happen in Houston, like that of earlier this year. Texas A&M came out with a report with Dr. Garrett Sampson and released a report that said within the community of Harrisburg, Manchester, 5 toxics were found after a daily snapshot event, meaning this was after a light rain event, not a heavy flood event, not a heavy rain event. If these are the conditions that communities and residents of the communities of environmental justice communities like Manchester, Harrisburg are exposed to, then we can only assume that during extreme weather conditions and heavy floods, those chemicals and toxins are even worse. These are the people's lives that are at risk on a daily basis. Communities like that of Manchester, Harrisburg, of Plaquemines Parish, of all along from Texas to Louisiana, Cancer Alley. In communities like Manchester, where the population is 98% minority population and 84% of that is Latino, where language isolation is not only an issue during extreme events, but on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvette, and thank you, André. So our next speaker is Susan Pacheco.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I am here to talk about health effects of climate change. And I have to say that until recently, climate change was not, the health effects of climate change was not in the climate conversation. So it's something over the last 10, 15 years that we're starting to hear more and more. And it's a CERN, we have a sense of alarm because of climate change is doing to the health, and it's something that is involving all populations. And as you can see here, the medical communities are putting policy statements and position statements and technical reports to make people aware of what climate is doing to our populations. So it may sound as an anecdote, but in my own practice, I'm starting to see that life is changing and children are experiencing a new normal. For example, I have a couple of kids that I remember who monitor their quality index with their parents. The kids know that on days of extreme heat, they cannot go out. They also know, and actually I've had a couple of them that use a cooling vest, which I didn't know until I met some of my patients. And my husband, who's an internist, is already seeing a good population of patients with renal disease and diabetes that are even more affected on days of extreme heat. So anyway, saying the same that all of us are saying, climate change is about vulnerability. It'll be the poor, it'll be children, it'll be elderly, it'll be those with chronic conditions, but also communities of colors, immigrants, and individuals that had limited proficiency in English. Let me just review some demographics of Texas so we can get a feel. People over 65 years of age are 11.7% of our population. Less than 18 years are 26.3%. Uninsured, we're the capital of uninsured in the US. It's at least 17%, and this includes 623,000 children. Poverty line, 1 in 5 children in Texas lives within the poverty line. We have 24% of the population living in coastlines, and that's vulnerability in the context of sea level rise. And we have around 600,000 children with asthma. So again, these are all of the individuals, and this is just a very brief list that will be affected by the effects of climate change. Now, we know that sea level rise will affect, we know that heat events will affect, we know that the distribution of infections is changing. We know that we're having or will have more extreme weather events. And just as an example, in 2011, the heat wave in Texas, there were 3.6% increases in emergency room visits. Most of these visits were people over 65 years of age. We know that people with asthma are going to be affected more with changes in temperature. We also know that the allergenicity of certain plants increases with increased temperature and CO2 concentrations. Air quality in Texas, we're not the best. We have the dubious honor of being in the top 25 cities in the US with increased higher concentrations of ozone. And actually, we're starting to see the effects of air pollution in Texas because the number of children with preterm birth and the number of children with prematurity has increased when they are exposed to air pollution. In Katrina alone, over 1 million people were displaced from the Gulf. More than 160,000 children were displaced from Louisiana and Mississippi, and it's sobering because 50,000 children missed school between 2005 and 2006. Around 15% of children missed 1 year of school, and we had the last 5,000 children that spent some time without their parents, and the last one was relocated with his parents after 6 months of Katrina. So vector-borne diseases are going to increase. We know that the increased droughts will have increased wildfires and population displacement, and that is going to be affecting our population. Now, something that we're not prepared for, and I want us to think about this, is right now in our medical society, mental illness is neglected. We don't pay attention to that. We know that with extreme weather events, and Katrina is one of the best examples that we have, PTSD increase, depression increase, and this happened in the pediatric population, and this happened in the adult population. And we're simply not prepared to these events. Our populations are not prepared, and our infrastructure is not ready to absorb this problem. So the question is, what are we doing? And this is a question that we need to reflect about. What are we doing? Are we ready to face this challenge? In Texas, are we ready to face the consequences of climate change in human health? Now, most of us here in this room will be able to cope. You know, we have decent houses, we have AC, we have nice cars, we know where to go, we have family support. Most people in the state of Texas do not have that luxury. We don't have the infrastructure in our state to deal with this problem. We don't have the public health resources to deal with this problem. So we need to act. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Susan. And just to remind, some of you came in late. If you have questions, please write them on the cards, and somebody's going to pick them up in just a few minutes. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Dr. Robert Bullard, you all know.
Good afternoon. My presentation examines climate change and vulnerability and building community resilience. Climate change, let me first back up. The impacts of environmental problems have been documented for decades. Numerous studies show that low-income communities and communities of color are impacted disproportionately by pollution. And that vulnerability places them at great risk when it comes to health and economics and et cetera. Climate change will only exacerbate those existing vulnerabilities. And so when we talk about this whole question of what makes a community vulnerable, we have to look at, again, pre-existing conditions. The whole idea that the United States is a big country, and we have basically 4 major regions, Northeast, South, Midwest, and West. But all regions are not created equal. All communities are not created equal. There are some that are more equal than others. And so when we talk about vulnerability and we talk about the ability to bounce back and to be resilient, we have to understand that's not all equally distributed. The 2014 National Climate Assessment Report described certain regions with specific vulnerability, and the Gulf Coast Southeast region is especially vulnerable, exceptionally vulnerable to sea level rise, extreme heat, hurricanes, and decreased water availability. If we look at, for a period of the last decade or so, the southern United States, which in this case we're talking about the Gulf Coast and the South Atlantic region, has experienced disasters at a ratio of 4 to 1. In other words, it's very risky where we are. The Southeast, for example, for the period 1980 to 2012, had more billion-dollar disasters than all of the other regions combined. And so when we talk about overlaying demographics and including economics and ethnicity, spatial location, who's in that floodplain, who's living in close proximity to the kinds of facilities that are contributing not only to greenhouse gases, but also those co-pollutants. So many of the fence line, frontline communities view climate change not just in the context of greenhouse gases and parts per billion, but also see it as a justice issue, as a social equity issue, and as an issue that historically understand that if we increase this whole idea of staying on, this carbon treadmill, it can only get worse for those communities that are already experiencing disasters. So we're not just talking about something 20, 30 years from now. For many communities, climate change is already here. And if we look at that perfect storm where climate and economics is coming together, and if you look at those, Oxfam did a study in 2014 looking at 13 states. If you look at those areas that are most vulnerable, not only to, as I said, the social vulnerability, but the vulnerability to climate, you can see that there's tremendous kinds of correlation and tremendous kinds of overlap. The same communities that are experiencing economic and health disparities and other kinds of wealth disparities are also will be impacted disproportionately by climate. If we just take, for example, where are the oil refineries? Oil refineries, there are about 150 of them in 32 states. And again, if we map where they are, a disproportionate share of them, if we talk about the Gulf Coast, we can see those dots. And those are not made-up dots. Those are not alternative facts. Those are real dots. That these are refineries, and they're disproportionately located in communities of color. And communities of color are disproportionate. I mean, over 50% of the oil refineries are located nationally in communities of color. And if we zero down to the Gulf Coast, those numbers move way up above 50, 60%. And if we just go to Texas, those numbers go off the chart. So when we talk about this whole idea of vulnerability and health, and over half of the residents who live near the nation's 150 refineries that are exposed to pollution that elevate their cancer risk, you can see that number is 50% for minorities in terms of minority population, and minorities or people of color only make up about 37%. If you overlay race, that maps in terms of vulnerability and the issue of low-lying areas, flooding, droughts, heat waves, etc. If you also overlay poverty and income status, you'll find that the issue of justice and a climate action plan that we are talking about putting in place has to address justice, fairness, and equity, and it's called climate justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bullard. So our final speaker is Bob Litterman. Let me remind you all, please give us some good questions that we can address after this session.
Thank you, Dr. Lane. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess my role is to serve as the cleanup hitter and take the observations that we've gotten from the scientists and the folks who think about social justice and the impact on human conditions and what does it mean for the fossil fuel companies and for the investors and the shareholders in these companies. And there are a number of risks involved here. There is certainly the risks that we've talked about in terms of climate impacts. There's also risks for investors and shareholders and for the management of the corporations. Today, when people think about the responsibilities of corporations, they think about a broad view of stakeholders, the employees, the communities, as well as the shareholders. If we go back to the views of Milton Friedman years ago, he said, look, the only interest of the management is to increase shareholder value. But even Milton Friedman said there's two caveats there. They have to be, the actions have to be legal and they have to be ethical. And we've got some problems with the fossil fuel companies on those two scores, and I'll talk about that. But let's start by looking at the economics of the situation. I'm an economist, and I spent 30 years on Wall Street and in managing risks. And so I bring that perspective to this problem, and I want you to focus on incentives. As Dr. Lane said originally, it's very clear what we have to do. We have to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that we put in the atmosphere. What that means is we have to change incentives. If you want to change behavior, you change incentives. And what that means in this context is a carbon tax. We need to create a carbon tax, and the only question is where it should be set. How strong should that tax be? And it should be set immediately, by the way. Think of it this way. Historically, people thought that fossil fuels were a scarce resource. Today, what we understand is that the Earth's atmosphere has a limited capacity to safely absorb emissions. So that capacity is a scarce resource. We have to allocate it by pricing it. And so we have to think about where and how do we set that price. That's really what it's all about. Now, when we think about that capacity, it brings up a question of profound uncertainty. No one knows what that capacity is. When I say a capacity to safely absorb emissions, let's talk about safety and risk, because I'm not talking about the first impacts. We've already seen the first impacts. They're here. We're losing the coral reefs. We're acidifying the ocean. We're creating extreme weather events that we can attribute to climate change. We're impacting people's lives. There are heat waves where hundreds, if not thousands, of people die. These are already impacts from climate change. I'm talking about catastrophic impacts. And by catastrophic, I don't mean hurricanes or heat waves. I mean a permanent impairment of human well-being, not just us and our children and our children's children, but going on generation after generation after generation. We could reach a tipping point where there is no turning back, where we lose control. Now, where might that be? Do any of the scientists know? Is it at 650 parts per million? No one knows. 450? Some people think it's already happened. They think 350. Okay? That's what we call uncertainty, profound uncertainty. We have to manage that. Okay? Now let me bring the first slide up here. Oop, I think did I go the wrong way? There we go. Financial risk management brings a number of lessons that we can apply to climate change. The first lesson is you have to worry about worst-case scenarios. Scientists don't like to talk about worst-case scenarios. People call them alarmists. If your job is risk management, that's what you have to do. You have to think about worst-case scenarios. And what I'm going to tell you is we have no idea. There is a profound uncertainty. This is a very complex system. We're doing an experiment on it for the first time. We haven't done this 1,000 times and said, look, maybe nothing bad will happen, or here's the probability of something bad. It's the first time we're doing it. How big this experiment is very important, okay? That matters. A growing risk is an urgent priority. Time is of the essence. When you're a risk manager, if you have enough time, you can solve almost any problem. It's when you run out of time that a risk becomes a catastrophe, okay? Third thing to understand is the purpose of risk management is not to minimize risk. When the partners of Goldman Sachs hired me as risk manager 25 years ago, they didn't say, Bob, we want you to minimize risk. They wanted to make money by taking risk. The point is to price risk appropriately. And what we are not doing today is we're not pricing risk, okay? The incentive that we create to reduce emissions is the price of climate risk. Right now, it is a negative price. Globally, the incentives to produce and consume fossil fuels are many times the meager incentives that exist in some locations to reduce emissions. Okay, the foot is on the accelerator. I'm going to call the price of emissions the brake. We have to brake. The only question is how hard. And I want you to focus on that. And you might ask, by the way, final point before I move on, risk is what we measure. Again, when the partners of Goldman Sachs asked me to be head of risk management, they wondered whether that was even a partner level position. Luckily for me, they decided yes, okay? But the point was, risk is just measuring something. Managing is uncertainty. Uncertainty is what we manage. Now, this dramatic picture, why did I put this up there? Well, because I happened to be there. I came within a fraction of a second of dying in this horrific accident. And I'll tell you what happened just very quickly. We were driving into the city. I don't remember what happened before, but at one point my wife said, "Oh my God, Bob, watch out." And it was the tone of her voice and the way she said it. I looked up and I saw this 18-wheeler coming down the highway the other way, bouncing out of control, flame coming out from under the passenger wheel. I slammed on the brakes. I was in the far left lane and I moved over to the right because I immediately saw that the worst case might be really bad. There's a little median there between the two sides of the freeway. I thought that might not be enough. There were some things I didn't know. That truck had already hit another car. The driver of that car was killed. And we watched in horror over the next 5 seconds as that truck continued. It wasn't going straight down the highway. It was coming straight at us. And it wasn't just an 18-wheeler. It was a gasoline tanker with 9,000 gallons of gasoline and a lit fuse. And we watched as it rolled up over that median and dropped down right in front of us. Okay? And we were lucky enough that we had enough time to slow down and move over and go by that. Now, we got covered, the car got covered with oil. The debris that was bouncing in front of us created scratches on the car, and the heat from that flame is what I remember the most. It was a fraction of a second. We were going about 20 miles an hour as we went by, just a foot or two from that flaming cab. Now, why do I tell you that story? Because where we are with respect to climate risk is my wife, Mary, is saying, oh my God, Bob, watch out. That's what scientists are saying. And governments are sitting in the driver's seat. And you've got fossil fuel companies and their shareholders sitting in the back seat. And the fossil fuel company is holding a gun to the driver saying, don't you dare hit the brake. And saying to the shareholders, don't worry, everything's under control. Okay? We've got plenty of time here. And don't worry about the valuation of your assets, because governments are never going to hit the brake. Yeah. Oops, let me go on. Now, what are these fossil fuels companies doing about this? Well, the shareholders are saying, tell us what you're going to do. What's your plan? What's your story? Okay, and that's what's going on in these shareholder meetings. Shareholders have a right to honest answers from these companies. And now both Chevron and Exxon have written reports about this. Chevron, I have to give them some credit. They have come out and actually honestly answered. And what they said is, look, if we have to move to a carbon-constrained world, that means there's going to be less demand for fossil fuels, there are going to be lower prices, and that's going to be difficult for us. Okay? That's the honest-to-God answer. Okay? And coal has already, as you probably know, gone bankrupt. All the big coal companies have gone bankrupt. The question today is expensive oil versus cheap oil. We're going to have less demand for oil, and that means we're not going to need expensive oil. Things like Arctic, deep sea, tar sands, they're stranded assets. They're like the buggy whip. And so companies that are in the business of extracting expensive sources of oil, like Exxon and Chevron, are stranded assets, okay? And their valuations are in trouble. Now, let's look at Exxon. You may know that Exxon now is being prosecuted by the attorneys general in New York and in Massachusetts. And what they're being prosecuted for is a report that they wrote called Energy and Carbon, Managing the Risk. Exxon said in this report that was published 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, they said, don't worry about us. None of our assets are going to be stranded, because governments are never going to move quickly to a low carbon economy. All of our fossil fuel reserves are going to be, we're going to be able to sell them. And then why is it that governments are never going to move? Well, because it's so expensive. Read what they say, different levels of CO2. They wrote a report, they made it seem like their scientists created this report, like this was some actually accurate depiction of the future. They quote, as you can see on this report, a study. This graph comes from data produced by a group of scientists and economists at MIT, okay? Exxon did their own conversion of this report, okay? And what they said is, it's going to be too expensive. Different levels of CO2 are converted into annual energy costs for an average American family earning the median income. For example, by 2030, for the 450 parts per million scenario, the low carbon stabilization, the average American household would face an added CO2 cost of almost $2,350 per year for energy, amounting to 5% of total before tax median income. These costs would need to escalate steeply over time. And you can see this graph, and on the left side, on the left side is the graph, on the right side, you see Exxon's conversion to the additional cost for the average American household. And there at the top, you see 44%, which I've circled. The Attorney General of New York said, I want to know where that 44% came from. And I'll tell you why he said that. The economist for MIT, who wrote this report, says it'll cost a maximum of less than 1%. In fact, less than 100 times what Exxon came up with in their conversion. How did they do that? Well, they assumed that people won't change their behavior when the price of emissions goes from $0 to $1,000 a ton. They'll keep emitting the same amount of emissions, okay? That's ridiculous, okay? Second thing they do is they compare costs 75 years in the future with income today. Incomes grow over time, okay? Third thing they did is they said, well, we're only going to look at the gross cost. In other words, you impose a carbon tax, you're going to have actually trillions of dollars of revenue, okay? What happens to that revenue? They act as if it's just all burned or something. Okay, it's the net cost that matters. Okay, and finally, the logic here is just totally, they got the sign wrong. If you're worried about how expensive it's going to be in the future for people because there's no capacity to put those emissions in the atmosphere, what should you do? Should you charge a higher price today or a lower price? Should you waste that or should you conserve more? Okay, this is just total BS. And you can't get away with that. You can't go to your shareholders and say, don't worry, I'm going to make up a story. Now it's come out that Rex Tillerson used a secret alias, Wayne Tracker, to communicate with the directors of Exxon about climate risk. You can see why. If you have an honest answer, you don't make up this malarkey. You tell the honest truth. And the honest truth is moving to a low carbon economy, which we are doing, is going to be bad for companies that are in the business of extracting from expensive sources of oil. Okay, and by the way, Exxon's not the worst. The Koch brothers, Russian oligarchs that are in the oil business, they're all in it together. And they're all, I think, in deep trouble. We're moving quickly to a low carbon economy. We're going to get a carbon tax. Now, no one knows exactly what the right tax should be, by the way. These models, the US government estimates $40 a ton. Okay, but the IPCC, in their last report, I think, came out with a much better answer. They said, look, these models have all kinds of problems. We should either, we don't know what the right discount rate is, we don't have the right catastrophic risks in them. They went on, and they were right. These models are very uncertain. We don't know what the future's going to be. So you can get a number anywhere from $2 a ton to $200 a ton, but they said the right thing. When you have uncertainty like that, you have to err on the side of caution, okay? So scientists are saying it's time to slam on the brakes. And I'm telling you, it is time to slam on the brakes, and that's not going to be good for the fossil fuel companies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you all panelists for those provoking presentations. I think the situation is clear, and that generates a lot of questions here. So let me ask, the first one is to André Droxler, and that's to help us understand why coral matters other than it's beautiful and all that. But we get food from the sea. What's the role of coral?
Is that on? It is on. Good. Corals are, we call them now the rainforest, of the ocean. It's the area of the ocean with the highest species diversity. So if the corals disappear, many, many species are going to disappear, and they're already disappearing because of this amazing ecosystem that are coral reefs. So coral reefs are, for instance, kind of the nurseries with the mangroves. Often we forget about associating coral reefs, tropical coral reefs, with mangroves. They are often associated because they lived in this very kind of narrow range of temperature, therefore of latitudes. Yes. So both of them are nursery for the fisheries. I mean, if you ever had a chance, and I hope you have in your life, and you will in the future, go to visit a coral reef. And when you go to see some areas where you see, not hundreds or thousands of little minnows, but, tens of thousands. And so you can see all the species of corals. Obviously, the corals can recover, but the rates of change is such that the coral species we have today cannot really, adapt fast enough. Yes, I forgot, I think in my talk to mention that temperature was, the corals live in a very narrow temperature. Probably about, kind of 18 degrees Celsius is the lower. We thought that this was the main important part. 29 degrees Celsius is really kind of the highest temperature for these open water tropical coral reefs. And you don't have to reach a temperature of 30 degrees for probably kind of more than a month or two. The corals bleach. The corals live in a very interesting environment. They've colonized low nutrients environment of the ocean. Quite a few people don't understand this. They are the cacti of the deserts. They are able to live there because they adapt themselves by producing their own nutrients. They live in symbiosis with an algae called zooxanthellates. If the temperature increases by 1 degree Celsius in a few weeks or a few months, they expel these zooxanthellates. Those zooxanthellates don't have the pigmentation, they're colorful. Therefore, kind of the corals become white, they bleach. And if all of these zooxanthellates are expelled, now the corals don't produce enough food for survival. So it's the reason why they are the canaries of our Earth. The mine canaries of our Earth. They are the most sensitive to this slight change of temperature of about 1 degree Celsius. They are very sensitive.
Thank you very much, André. So it's a question for Kathy and maybe Bob or others. Questions about Aramco. Nobody said anything about Aramco. Any comments about where they are, what they're doing?
Sure, I'll be happy to answer. Saudi Arabia has the cheapest oil in the world. And as I discussed, this is now a difference between expensive sources of oil, which we don't need, and cheap oil. So we are going to need the oil from Saudi Arabia, and they will be the suppliers. If you are an owner of a reservoir of cheap oil, the way that you maximize the value of that in a world where there's less demand for fuel is you take market share. It makes absolutely no sense to let others produce the oil and you keep yours in the ground where it's not ever going to be produced or used. So, but before you take market share, what you might want to do is pull it back and sell it off. So right now there is a proposal to do an IPO of Aramco. Basically, you sell that, the crown jewels of Saudi Arabia. Why are they selling them? Because they think they might be stranded. They recognize that and they want to diversify. And so that's what they're doing. And while you're doing that, while you're in the process of selling off that asset, you want to keep the price of oil as high as you can. Now, there's a permanent glut of oil in the world. So they're pulling back, they're organizing this constraint on oil production while they sell off as much of Aramco as they can.
If I can just add
Please,
briefly to that, one of the reasons that we at the Union of Concerned Scientists are focusing on investor-owned companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron is because of the role that they've played in a concerted disinformation campaign. So if we look back to, for example, 1998, there is an infamous memo by the American Petroleum Institute laying out a deliberate campaign to confuse the public about climate science and really try to block climate action. Everything from getting scientists who were skeptical about climate science to come to be sponsored by these fossil fuel companies to attempting to influence how these issues are studied in school and putting money behind it. And so, what we're doing is really holding these companies accountable, the investor-owned companies, for their deception and disinformation, which continues to this day. And that's one of the things that we exposed in the Climate Accountability Scorecard that was available. There were some copies available outside the room, and you can get it online at our website as well.
Thank you. So then we have a question about South Florida. I mean, there's a feeling that a lot of vulnerable people in South Florida and Dade County, and so in comparing vulnerabilities around the country, what would you say about South Florida? And a related question is where you want to tell your grandchildren to live in this country?
Higher than South Florida. South Florida is interesting, and the Florida, government has even banned to mention climate change or even sea level rise in most of their documents. And, the sea level rise, kind of the idea of sea level rising, to see these big waves coming in, yes. but it's not really, the way it's going to happen. Yes, it's going to happen during major storm, hurricane, huge surge, yes. So higher the level is, kind of more impact this surge is going to be. But at the moment in Florida, and if you have been in South Florida, in Miami Beach, in Hollywood, now during kind of unusually low tide, the water is not coming from the coast, but it's seeping up. So it's flooding, the very low areas within, kind of Miami Beach. So, there's no rain. There's, kind of, the water is just coming up. And another big issue, in South Florida is the drainage system of the sewage. So when, kind of the system is moving, kind of when the water table is moving upward, how can you drain the sewage into, some of the ocean? So they're changing, they're spending billions of dollars to try not to modify, kind of the sewage system. So these are going to be issues for every single huge city, within the coast. And Florida is probably one of the most, most recent, or the first one, kind of to see on this water table moving upwards because of sea level rise.
Dr. Bullard, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I think you're right. Having flood streets on sunny days when there's not been any rain, that's a new phenomenon. And I think the whole coastal area of Florida, because it sticks out as a peninsula, it's in trouble. And as you move across the Gulf Coast and Mobile, Pensacola, Gulfport, New Orleans, Houston, and come all around, you're talking about some tremendous kinds of problems in terms of sea level rise. As a matter of fact, there's one New York Times reported the first, quote, climate refugees in the U.S. Is in Louisiana, a tribe that in a parish south of New Orleans that was relocated, or in the process of being relocated. The federal government paid, I think, something like $47 million to relocate this tribe from their ancestral home. They've been there, they were there before the country was a country, U.S. was a country. And so there's quite a bit of misinformation about what's happening in the Gulf Coast, the coastal areas. And as a matter of fact, but going back to Florida, I think the governor a couple of years ago of Florida basically mandated that climate change be stripped from the state agency jargon. So to deny it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
We have one question here about faith communities. So we got scientists and activists and politicians and all kinds of folks talking about this, but a very large number of the American people go to church, interact socially with faith communities. So isn't there a role here? If so, who's pushing it along? Anybody on the panel?
I think the climate justice part of the climate movement has a very strong faith community part of that movement, and I think a lot of it grows out of this whole idea of stewardship, and it also grows out of social justice, and grows out of dealing with humanity, the humanity part of the climate argument. And so you get, this collaboration, coalition, cross fertilization of faith groups and community-based groups and health groups and young people working on these issues, and legal. I mean, there are more and more lawsuits now being brought on against governments around climate, brought by a coalition of those groups that I've just talked about.
Yeah, just to add, the faith community has been a real leader in shareholder advocacy, so operating under the umbrella of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. They've been bringing shareholder resolutions to these companies now for many years, and starting to see the progress that we're seeing and the high votes that we're seeing with the fossil fuel and utilities companies calling on them to plan for a carbon-constrained world is really building on groundwork that's been laid by faith communities. For example, Westpath, the Methodist pension fund, was the proponent of a resolution at Chevron that helped to lead to the report that Chevron did produce, and they recognized that as a first step, and also said that we want to see, really more detail about how the company is planning, and in terms of its business strategy. So it is a really important component. I actually serve on the Socially Responsible Investing Committee of the Unitarian Universalist Association, which is one of the member organizations of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility.
Thank you.
Shortly, in terms of, I didn't see you. Okay. But I'm going to be short. Today, something very happened. I mean, Pope Francis wrote this amazing, encyclic. What did he give to President Trump? He gave him a copy of it. So I think, I'm saying by this that, yes, even religion at a very high level is really, kind of taking a leadership, into, kind of this movement, of people understanding, kind of that the earth is changing and it's not on our favor.
Well, actually, in the same note, after the Pope's encyclical, things change and have been changing, because many faith communities are just taking a stand and saying we need to pay attention to what's happening with climate. Not only, of course, from a health perspective, which is what I talk about, but also from a social justice perspective. So it's a movement that is really has a lot of power, and I think that it's been a significant change after these statements came from the Pope.
There's several questions here that tend to focus on politics.
I'd like to
I'm
add-
sorry. Yes,
I'd like
please,
to add to
Yvette.
the faith communities. Even though there are high-level responses that talk about progressive views with climate change, industries with a lot of influence know where the community lies and leans on support. They also are very aware where momentum can be gained to push against these influences. So what we have experienced in our community organizing is that many times corporate monies go into the local churches in order to influence them not to work with community advocacy groups. This last December, we hold a Frontline Communities, or a Frontline Christmas event, where we raise money and toys in order to give back to affected communities. We reached out to the faith community in that neighborhood who refused to work with us because they, at the time, were receiving massive donations from not only Valero, but also Westway Chemical, and also further up. And you see this again in Baytown. Baytown is Exxon Village. Baytown is a town completely owned by Exxon. And you see these influences throughout their community too. So although on higher levels there's very wonderful progressive thinking, please understand that these industries know where the communities lean and put their faith in. And they're going to go ahead and use our own strategies against us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was asked to comment on the demographics of the audience this evening. We have not polled the audience, but I'm on the long tooth end of the audience, I know, but several of you have joined me here this evening. So that is a question about generational issues. Also, this is Rice University, but the students are all gone because they graduated or didn't, but anyway, they left. They left campus, so otherwise I know we would have a lot more young people here this evening. But there are some issues here about who cares, who's in a position to spend a little time working on these issues, who would have influence. It's a nonpartisan kind of issue. Our problem is political polarization, and several of the questions, whole piles of them actually, touch on politics in today's polarized America. So maybe just ask you a question about that. Given sort of an almost unprecedented level of polarization, we've had it before, but not recently. So we had it in McCarthy days, we had it over the Vietnam War, we had it around the Civil War time. You could pick 3 or 4 times in American history where perhaps we as a nation were as polarized as we are today, although around different issues. Given that, and given that, I think Nixon, as one of our questioners pointed out, Nixon administration created EPA with the help of Congress. George Bush, 41, signed the Montreal Protocol and the agreement in law, in international law, that the United States would indeed participate with other countries to address climate change. That was signed by a Republican president. So there were times when we were thinking perhaps working more together than we are right now. Is there some advice here on how to try to move the needle in the next several years? Bob mentioned carbon tax, another one of our questions. Is that realistic to think might happen in the next 3 years or so? So let me start with that while the others are thinking about the politics, because we really do need some insights here on politics.
Well, I think it's very likely that we'll get a carbon tax. We absolutely need one. I mean, this is life or death. And in terms of politics, look, I've talked to a lot of Republicans on Capitol Hill. If the administration would come out in support of a carbon tax, you would get bipartisan support for sure. You know, my representative is Leonard Lance from New Jersey. I went and saw him. He said, Bob, you know, I was one of 8 Republicans who voted for Waxman-Markey. You know how many of them are left? He's the only one. He said, don't ask me to speak out publicly. We need cover, is what he said. And what is he talking about? He's talking about the dark money, the Koch brothers money, the fossil fuel money. They systematically go after these congressmen. Talk to Bob Inglis, who was voted out of office when he tried to support a carbon tax. So these guys will not go out on their own. They won't speak publicly, but you'd be surprised. This is like gay marriage or something, that it looks like it's impossible until it happens. And you know, I actually thought it might happen under Trump, because his head of national economic policy is a guy named Gary Cohn, who I know very well. He's a smart guy. He understands risk management. And, you know, there's some bad actors in the White House, obviously. Trump himself is obviously an idiot and willing to go either way on anything. So I thought, you know, we might get it. Because, by the way, it makes so much sense. You know, that economist at MIT who thought, well, it might cost a small fraction of 1%. There's a lot of economists, including myself, who think if we actually got a carbon tax, that would stimulate the economy. Because, you know, it reduces the uncertainty. It creates $2 to $4 trillion over 10 years of revenues that you can use to, you know, you can certainly give dividends back. If you give it all back in dividends, it would make 70% of people better off, okay? Poor people, people who don't use as much energy, would get a dividend bigger than what they would pay through the tax. So, you know, but you could also reduce corporate taxes. You could do, you know, you could pay for health care, you could pay for education. There's so much you could do. It would, I think, stimulate the economy. So this is such a good idea. I think it could easily happen. Now, I think it's unlikely it'll happen under Trump. I'm not sure how many more weeks he's going to be in power, but...
Some of you may know that Secretary James Baker, who worked for Republican administrations, came out in favor of a carbon tax with George Shultz and other colleagues of that era. Okay, others about the polarization of American politics. How are we going to make progress in such a situation?
Well, I think if we look at a future going forward and looking at some point, there's a group that we will have to write off, and in terms of age demographics. If you look at millennials down, there's more consensus on issues around climate and other issues of justice that are not as wedged and polarizing. And I think that there's a big push now among our environmental justice and climate justice folks to organize and mobilize young people and to get them in positions to own this issue and to get them to understand the potential power that they have, that they're not exercising that power, but that they still have the power. Millennials outnumber baby boomers right now. And so not to say we got to write off my generation, but we do have to think about transitioning to that other demographic that's more inclined to work on issues across those structural barriers and, in many cases, those artificial barriers. And so it's not a short-term, 4-year kind of deal. It's more of a long-term, mid-term kind of a strategy. And within the next, 2042, and you can pull out your calculators and figure that out. By 2042, the United States will be majority people of color. We shouldn't be waiting until 2042 to plan for that transitioning and to try to get, I guess, a good consensus and mobilization of a collective around those issues that we see as important, including healthcare, education, environment, climate, those things that we know that have somehow been distorted. Just like you said, Richard Nixon created the EPA. And so it was not, a Republican issue, it wasn't a Democratic issue. So I think that's what I see in terms of our work. And the last point is that a colleague and I have, at Dillard University in New Orleans and myself at Texas Southern University, we've organized HBCU Climate Change Consortium. There are 104 black colleges in the United States with 90% located in the South. Many of them are located in these very vulnerable communities that we're talking about climate change. They're also located near these very dangerous chemical plants and refineries, et cetera. And we're trying to organize and mobilize our young people to take on these issues, to have them to own these issues. And we've organized 5 climate change conferences. In 2016, December, we took 50 black college students to COP21 in Paris. This is the first time there's ever been that many African American students at a climate meeting. So I think we're planning and working on that generational shift, and that's a long-term strategy. That's not 4 years. That's the hope that I see of working with young people to get them to take this on, to own it.
Anybody? Thank you very much. Anybody else want to comment on the political scene?
Political stance?
I think.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Is this on? Okay. And it's very interesting that you say that. I think we need to work at various levels. And let me drop the responsibility to you, because we hear these talks the same way that I have it here, but we hear these talks, we hear this information, and the question that we have to ask ourselves in the audience is, what am I going to do? We have a privilege. We have the privilege of knowledge. We know all of this information. We heard these wonderful experts. We have the privilege of knowledge. It's the responsibility. We need to work. So the question is, what are you guys going to do within your constraints? And all of us have them, but what are you going to do with this information? I know that all of us know a child, have a mother, have a father, have a grandparent, and I'm not saying that just for manipulation. Climate change is happening, and we don't see it, but health is being affected. And we are, well, many of us are going to be, we're lucky in a sense. First, because the effect of climate change will not affect us as much, but it's the millennials coming and their children and their future generations. We are not going to see the reality of the crisis. What we're seeing is minimal, and we're going to, it's going to pass us. But the generations coming are going to do it. So it's very interesting because I'm working with some millennials, and my question is, how do we engage you guys? What do we do to engage you? And each one of them gives a different reply, but in reality, this is a problem of the millennials, because I'll be dead in a few years. It's a problem of the millennials, and we need to get them involved, number one. Number two, the other thing is that we need to educate our communities, because it's a limited number of people that understands climate change. And the vulnerable communities, many of them, are not aware of this because they have other concerns. So education is the key to empowerment. And if we don't empower people, it's not going to happen. And we won't be able to help us move forward. Okay.
Thank you very much. Any other comments? Yes, Yvette?
I think you're right when you're talking about millennials and how they're all over the place. We're all over the place. But I think that the broader reason why is because millennials don't just care about one subject. They care about a lot of subjects. So make sure that when you're here and you're listening to these talks about environmental awareness and climate change, that a millennial is thinking about LGBTQ rights, they're thinking about immigration, they're thinking about education, and you see this all throughout social media. So make sure that you don't have one passion, you don't have one cause, because they're all intertwined. The entire subject of environmental justice is the intersectionality of every one of these issues, from health to immigration to education to food security. And so it's not just an issue with one cause. It's the fact that we don't care about the entirety. And to say that we're working as a whole to move forward is meaningless if we're not working on all of these issues at the same time. So I encourage people to be aware of where you aren't educated, where you need to fill in those gaps, and speak to someone who knows about that issue so that you can exchange information. And most likely it's going to be a millennial. You're going to talk to someone who is younger than you, and don't take that as a fault on your own. Don't take that as a hit to your ego that this younger person knows maybe something more about trans rights or LGBTQ or even immigration, because just like Dr. Bullard said, 2024 is not too far away. And there's a big reason why there are so many mass deportations going on of not only people who lack status, but dreamers who have a right to be in this country. It is because the electorate is changing, and we need to be right there with them.
Thank you very much. André?
Yeah, maybe, just briefly, what's really interesting in what has happened in the past 10, 20 years, it's the adding, kind of doubts about the scientific process. And it's pretty surprising. And it's quite, prevalent, kind of in some of the states and in Texas, for instance. I mean, doubting about the scientific process as if a scientist would be somebody who would believe in his science. It's not a religion. Science is a set of experiment, data collection, and with this, coming up with, a conclusion. And Neal said it very clearly at the very beginning. Climate science is clear. You add CO2 in the atmosphere to the level that we have done with other greenhouse gases. The temperature is going up. It's related. We have data. And amazingly enough, kind of the US are heading the collection of all this wonderful data. You think about NOAA, you think about NASA, all the data we have in terms of climate change showing this great connection between increase of greenhouse gases and temperature increase. And we can make, equation, we can make models, and these models seem kind of to be with uncertainties, that's maybe the issues, but seems kind of to fit very well what we are observing. So it's a fairly simple physics or chemistry, mostly physics. But now, they try kind of the other side, the deniers, try kind of to doubt about science. Same thing, with smoking. Kind of in the 60s, they were just after, the cigarette companies would not only, kind of try not to doubt about, kind of the relationship, between cancer and cigarette, but they would now try, kind of to take, and make the scientist irresponsible or not even knowing what they are doing, by making this connection. And so it's the same thing, with climate science. And it's surprising that, in the 21st century, that we're doubting about the scientific process.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to...
Real quick, Neal, may I say something in regards to that's the problem with health. We cannot calculate what's going to, we don't have equations to define how the climate is affecting people. It's completely unpredictable, even though we see the trends. So that's why it's so difficult for people to realize that the health issue in the context of climate change is so serious, because we cannot quantify or we cannot calculate how much is happening.
Well, I'm going to take one more. Yeah, please.
When talking about issues like the carbon tax, I would be very wary to just say, yes, I'm on board with putting a price on carbon, and go ahead and look up the Gulf Coast Exchange. The Gulf Coast Exchange is a type of market that allows emitters to place a price on carbon and does not regulate. The market is held on TCEQ's site, and they're only there to publish the prices. There is no oversight, there's no regulation. This is a price set from emitter to emitter.
Okay, thank you so very much. I've asked, we have one sort of general question here about what, that really continues the discussion we've just had. What can we all do? And I know Kathy's thought a good bit about this, so maybe you wind us up with answering that question.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. I mean, we've heard from an incredible range of panelists about the climate risks that face our communities, what the fossil fuel industry can do to help avoid some of the worst effects of climate change. But companies like ExxonMobil and Chevron aren't the only ones who can take action. And if you're ready to get out there and do something, there are a few ways that you can help put the pressure on these companies right now, leading up to their annual meetings next Wednesday. So if you're a shareholder, you can vote or urge your pension fund or mutual fund to vote in favor of climate-related shareholder resolutions at ExxonMobil and Chevron. They have to answer to you on this. If you feel like speaking out and sharing some of what you've learned from the panel, write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper about the upcoming shareholders meetings, and make sure that you urge ExxonMobil and Chevron to take notice of this discussion that's happening right here in their backyard as they consider these climate-related resolutions. You can also participate in the online discussion on social media with the hashtag climate risk and the hashtag ExxonNew. And of course, support the organizations that have helped to put this panel on. So Public Citizen Texas, TEJAS, the HBCU Climate Consortium, the Texas Coalition for Climate Awareness, and you can sign up for UCS's Science Network or our Activist Network right outside for those who are in the room, or online at ucsusa.org. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So the other thing we can do, of course, is find people running for Congress, House, Senate, local offices, and so forth. Anybody in here running for Congress? Let us know. There's one in the back. Okay. So, seek out your favorite candidate, ask them what they think about climate change, and help them, because we obviously need their participation in Washington. This has been an extraordinary session. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank all of you in the room who came and behaved yourselves and sent in really good questions that I could only get to part of them I shouldn't dodge this one. What are the prospects of fossil fuel divestment at Rice University? Well, I have no idea, of course, not being involved, but I wanted to make sure everybody knew that that question got asked. We have a reception at which we will have wine and soft drinks, and please.
Yes. So, it's like, before, when the climate is going to be so warm, yes. Now in Texas, this cool front that came last night gave us amazing weather, so we know what's coming. So let's at least, come, to understand all this beautiful weather today. So instead of having our reception inside, we have the reception just when you leave the main door of the library.
Right.
We will have plenty of refreshment, some snacks, just to, enjoy these last few days before the summer comes in.
So bring all your questions to the panelists afterwards. For those of you who are watching webcast, we can't actually provide any wine and food, but we hope you have something there to enjoy. And the tweeters, keep tweeting the conversation as long as you like, and the webcast will stay up. Thank you, panel, and thank you, everyone. Beautiful question.